Hello and welcome to the Martial Arts Teaching Tactics Podcast. I'm Chris Kent, and I'm joining Chris Bean. Mr. Bean?
Hello, sir.
In this episode, we're going to discuss what spaced repetition is and how or if we should add this technique to our classes. Spaced repetition encourages learning over framing new information. So let's first take a look at what spaced repetition is. Spaced repetition is the process by which we learn something new, and specifically looking at the rate at which we choose to review that new material. The rate we choose to view the new material is key to understanding if we are able to retain the new information. Spaced repetition is about separating out the review time for new information and not cramming new information in a short time. Spaced repetition encourages active recall, which is vital to building the foundations to building or working on our long-term memory, which we just did a whole entire episode about short-term versus long-term memory. And this is a continuation of how we want to encourage or strengthen that long-term memory in our students.
With spaced repetition, we introduce new material gradually. As we go through the class, we repeat that information, continually adding on small chunks at a time. So again, spaced repetition, we gradually deliver, gradually give the information over a extended time. And as we come back to that material, you add a little bit more. You come back to the material, you add a little bit more. So each time they're getting good review time and then a little bit of new information to that previous information they've already had. Spaced repetition works by reviewing the same information at increasing intervals. As you're training your brain, you want to keep that piece of information stored longer into your long-term memory. So each time you bring up that information from wherever it's stored, short-term, working, or long-term memory, each time that information is brought up, it's going to get put back. And hopefully as it gets put back deeper and deeper into the memory store, hopefully into the long-term memory because it is brought up so frequently through the time. As this information resurfaces, it doesn't have to be the exact same drill. So what that means for us when we're on the training floor, if we're teaching a low block, for example, you do the low block, maybe you do it stationary without any footwork or anything in there. Okay, this is the basic outline of what the low block looks like. And then you let students practice that for a little while. Next time it comes back, the next class, maybe a week later or something, when it resurfaces again, you give that information, you go through the low block, but this time maybe you work on the footwork that's associated with that. Again, gradually adding on pieces of this. And then a week or so later, you come back, you do the low block again. This time you're moving forward, or you're doing it with a partner, you're doing it on a pad, you're working a practical application for it. This is where the variety in your classes can lay, because you don't have to do the exact same thing each time you cover that information. That would be boring, right? Each time you do a low block, you do it only in this one isolated instance. There's only this one isolated drill. You do that. Nope. Let it be, differentiate the opportunities to practice this, right? Okay, let's do it in partners. Let's do it with a line leader. Let's do some self-practice time on this. It doesn't have to be the exact same thing. As long as that information is resurfacing and the students are able to recall or work on active recall for that information, that's where this technique is going to lie, because they are, again, increasingly bringing back that information to the front of their mind. They're thinking about it. They're doing it. They're going through the motion for it. Then they can apply it. Again, it doesn't have to be the exact same drill. You can make it different each time you do it. What matters is that the information comes back. You don't want to, and you wouldn't do this anyways, but you wouldn't teach a low block per se on one class, one day in the beginning of your testing cycle, and then 2 or 3 months later when it comes time for testing and then require your students to test over that. That would be ludicrous. You can't, there's no way that they would be able to actually remember that. So of course, you're going to have to rehearse and review and go through this information. Active recall comes in with the time difference in between those reviews, right? Sometimes you do it, maybe you do new information at the beginning of class, and then in order to keep it fresh right before they leave, you review that information right before they leave for the day. That would be perhaps beneficial if you went through maybe a bit of a larger chunk. So instead of a small chunk, you did a little bit larger chunk of information. You taught it, you worked on it a little bit. Okay, you did some other stuff. Okay, now listen, let's touch on this one more time before you go, just to help keep it fresh as they leave for the day. Or perhaps you're gearing up for an extended break, a vacation, a Christmas break, or something like that, where there's a longer window in between when you're going to see them for the next time. That would be another instance that would be beneficial. Now, we're going to talk about a study here in a little bit that kind of flips that around, but just keep in mind with really this spaced repetition has to do with how frequently your students are called to review or rehearse or to go through that information that you're training with on the floor.
Yeah, and like you said, this is a proven or a tested method of learning. So in 2015, researchers at York University in Toronto looked at the advantages of applying a spacing effect in a review quiz to boost their participants' performance on a test. Following a 45-minute lecture, half the students took an online quiz after 1 day, while the other half took the quiz 8 days later. 5 weeks after that, all the students took their quizzes, and they all completed a final exam. Now, Mr. Beam, what would you think would be the results of that type of quizzing in order to boost those test scores?
Well, all of my common sense would tell me that the group that tested on the information the day later, they recalled that information while it was still fresh in their brain, I think that they would have done better. Common sense would tell you that, but what are the results?
Well, the results showed that students who took the quiz 8 days after the lecture performed significantly better on that final exam compared to those who took it only a day after. This suggests that spaced learning really helps to improve long-term memorization. And just talking about it, I'm sure that people who took the test right after may have done better on the quiz, but the study shows that the effect on the long-term memory was much better using that spaced repetition rather than taking the test right afterwards. So I guess it depends on what your goal is, which in our case is to boost the long-term memory, which the spaced repetition proves to have helped in that situation.
Yeah, I guess kind of thinking about that or breaking that down in my head, what I imagine happened was that, the students, everybody went to the lecture, they were told to take notes or do whatever they needed to do to think through that information or try to retain it because they knew that the test was going to happen later on. The half that took the quiz early, you're right, probably very likely they did well on the quiz. But they were, I think at that point, just giving the information back. They weren't necessarily thinking about the information, whereas the group that took the test 8 days later actually had to use their brain to think through that information. And perhaps they didn't do so well on that quiz initially, but because they thought about that material, while it wasn't necessarily super fresh in their brain, they had to use their brain, and they actually had to think about that. And so I think that process of really thinking about that helped to regenerate that information so it stayed fresh for a little bit longer for them because they didn't test over it right away. Because I think the test that they took right away, the group that took the test a day later, it's almost like they just gave all the information back. And then 5 weeks later when they took the quiz on it, it wasn't as fresh for them. It wasn't as memorable for them because they thought about it that one time. Maybe they reviewed a little bit here and there, but that group that did it, 8 days later, it wasn't super fresh for them. They really had to kind of dig through their memory and really think about that. And I think really that probably is what was the key takeaway for that. So in that, thinking about this, what can we bring to our classes that would help to facilitate this spaced learning effect? Well, for one thing, we can work on giving the information in smaller increments. This, of course, will help your students by preventing cramming of the new information. We want a sort of gradual consuming of the process of the information. So you don't want to give it to them and say, okay, here's everything you have to know, and the test is going to be 3 months from now. That's like trying to eat an elephant all at one time. Of course, if you had to eat an elephant, you'd want to do it in small bites, small chunks, small, gradual process. And so I think step number one for incorporating this process is to have a gradual consuming of the new material. Don't try to give too much at one time. And again, this goes back to what we talked about last time, where we want to just cover a handful of things, again, 7 plus or minus 2 new things in one class. And really that would be kind of the max. And so trying to chunk that information down so it's more of a gradual learning process, as opposed to here's everything, hopefully you get it, bye. Of course, that's probably not the best, but that's something I think we could probably work on in our classes by chunking that information down, or maybe instead of chunking the information down per day, we give the information, okay, here, I want you guys to work on this small section. Okay, we got 10 minutes to work on this, and so we give 2 minutes, okay, we'll do this. Work on it. Okay, now let's add this little bit on. Okay, great, now let's add this little bit on. As opposed to, in 10 minutes, okay, here's the whole drill, now I want you to work on it. So there can be some give and take, right? So try to think about how you can gradually deliver the information to the students.
Yeah, and when we are covering that new information, whether it be initially or when we go back to add on smaller pieces or smaller chunks of information, I think that covering the information needs to be given, or we need to make sure that we're allowing and offering sufficient feedback so that our students can practice on their own without implementing bad habits. So when we're doing that first thing, maybe doing a smaller part of it is better, so we can really cover how that technique should be done and different nuances of it, and make sure that they have an understanding of how it should be. So when they go to practice on their own, they're not doing it wrong because they're trying to do 3 times what they should be doing, trying to get so much of it done. We can really focus on a smaller piece and make sure that smaller piece is good and looks better and is done well, and then we can add on another piece, and those 2 smaller pieces will be equally as good because we took more time and offered the correct feedback to those pieces. And I think this will aid in their overall competence level in all of their techniques, rather than trying to give them a whole bunch at once and then it looks poor because they have so much to remember rather than that small piece really well. So it's kind of that balance, quantity over quality. Again, we talked about that in the past. Quantity over quality, whatever. Would you rather them know a small piece really well or a large piece kind of poorly? I think for the means and the way that we go about teaching, they should know that smaller piece really well, and then we can add on another smaller piece and make that larger piece. But it's going to take time. And again, this is just a reinforcement of their long-term memory with the different spaced repetition.
Another way that we can include this into our classes is by allowing your lesson plans to have follow-up practice. And so have that active recall, have that self-practice time in your class. This, is I'm sure something you already have in your lesson plans, but be very mindful about the purpose behind this follow-up practice, this self-practice time. We talked about last time with long-term and short-term memory, you want to make it meaningful. With this one, we're talking about the time in between those. And so really, with this one, specifically spaced repetition, we want to have the mindset of kind of planning out, okay, we did this on this day, now 2 or 3, 4 or 5, 8 days later, depending on however many, how much information you want to have in between or how many days you want to have in between for them to recall that information. Then, okay, here, now let's do this again. Okay, great. Now you wait X number of days. Okay, great. Here's this information again. So be very mindful about the purpose behind this follow-up practice. Is it there for it is there for your students to use active recall, to really think about, use their brains and think about the information that you're sharing with them. How can they use their brains? Do you want to kind of almost stretch them so they're real thin, almost to the point where they're making mistakes? And in fact, kind of want them to make mistakes because that's where the learning is going to happen. But it's not just for us, the instructors, to walk them through the information. We want them to really use their minds and think about this information. Again, perhaps a little bit thinner than you would otherwise want them to be. Allowing those mistakes to happen, right? You want to stretch them so thin that you're allowing those mistakes to happen. This, again, seems contrary to our ultimate goal, but these mistakes will aid the students in learning the information. When your students make mistakes, it means they're actively using their brains, although when you're watching a student make the mistake, it might not seem like they're using their brain. They are really trying, or in most cases, really trying to think through and work and call on that information that you've given them earlier. If you were to give them the answer each and every time they have a problem, before they even try to solve the problem for themselves, of course, they're not going to be using their brain to answer that. They're going to be taking your answer and implementing it, where that's not what we want. We want them to come up with the solutions, for them to come up with the fixes, the corrections kind of on their own. Oh, yep, you know what? I made that mistake. Let me go back. Let me fix that, right? Because they caught it themselves, because they're really thinking about that information. On top of this, when your student makes a mistake, give them an opportunity to fix it on their own. With this, you see that they made a mistake. Give them the opportunity to fix it for themselves. Of course, if they can't fix it, if you give them a minute, or maybe they didn't even notice that they made a mistake, okay, great. Then you can step in, you can correct it, you can talk about what happened, give them some feedback, and then move on. But at the very least, give them an opportunity to realize that, oh, you know what, something wasn't right there. Let me see if I can fix it, right? And of course, this involves kind of a encouraging type atmosphere in your classes. If the atmosphere isn't geared towards this type of learning, then the students are going to feel bad for making mistakes, or they're going to stop and wait for you to give them the answer. So you want to kind of give them an environment that making a mistake is okay. Okay, now that you made the mistake, let's talk about, okay, this is how that happened, right? This is what we need to do to fix that mistake. And then that mistake is gone. Don't worry about it anymore, because it's fixed. It's overridden with the correct way to do that information. If you have that type of atmosphere, then of course you will have a atmosphere that the students can actually learn from their mistakes, right? That's what we want. We again, let them make the mistakes. Okay, fine, no problem. You know what? That was incorrect. Do you know why it wasn't incorrect? Yeah, it's because of this. Okay, great, good. You know about it. Now let's fix it. And then they have an opportunity to fix it moving forward. Them being able to kind of go through that process for themselves, I believe, is a huge thing, huge for them to be able to make that correction and move past that, and that to not be an issue for them anymore. But it's because they did it themselves. They figured it out for themselves moving forward.
When the students are able to recognize and correct their own mistakes, then they are truly learning that information. This is, of course, where we want all of our students to be. With the spaced repetition, we will use self-practice time in class. That is the time to work on the information on their own. And this will be great to have a way for your students to actively recall their information, just like Mr. Bean was talking about. A side note to this, when often dealing with students, whether it be in a class or in a private lesson in a one-on-one basis, I know personally, at least, I really want to jump in and hound somebody if I do see a mistake. So if someone does the wrong move, I want to stop them right away and say, hey, that's wrong, do this, 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 this. Now, while that correction is being made, is that really beneficial to the student? Or would it be more beneficial for them to finish, maybe to say either, hey, you did something wrong, I need you to go back and fix it. Or if they do a move, and you can see on their face that it just didn't, there's some disconnect in their head, rather than saying, oh, actually, it should be this. Maybe prompt them by saying, hey, did that feel right? And they say, I don't think so. I say, okay, well, try again. What do you think it should be? And then more often than not, because of the training you did in class and the drills you ran together as a group, they're able to recall what it's supposed to be. They just had to make that mistake, like Mr. Bean said. Let them make the mistake. Let them think about it, and let them correct it. Now, it doesn't work every time. Sometimes they just don't know they're doing wrong, or they don't know what the right answer is. Then you can step in and give them that straight up factual correction. However, I think it's more beneficial for you to help guide them, or for lack of a better word, prod them into coming up with the right conclusion for themselves. Because like I said, sometimes they know it's wrong. They just don't know whether they should stop and fix it, or they don't, quite have the complete grasp of the information to know to stop themselves and fix it. But if we're with them in those situations, we can help push them in the right direction, so that when they're on their own, they make that same mistake. They think to themselves, oh, that didn't feel right. Let me do it again and make the correction that they know needs to be there. So just another layer to doing that. Once they can recognize their own mistakes and fix their own mistakes, that is a surefire proof. That is surefire proof that they're actually learning what they need to know and it's going to stay with them for a longer amount of time, which is, again, a good use for that spaced repetition, having them practice it with you, make those corrections, practice it on their own for a while, making the corrections for themselves, and coming back to the information. You can see how well they've been able to study and practice because of the work you already did previously.
With spaced repetition, of course, we want to take a look at how frequent we're going through and reviewing these moves in your class. Often, I will teach new information in one class. During this time, we'll spend 10 or 15 minutes on that new information. Then, the next class, we won't learn anything new, but we'll spend about 5 minutes on that information. And in that 5 minutes, maybe they'll go through the information 2-5 times, depending on how elaborate the moves are. But what that'll do is that 5-minute window. So in one class they learn it. Okay, great. Depending on the week or the class, maybe it's 2 days they come back. Maybe it's 4 days they come back. When they come back, don't learn anything new. Just review. Just touch on that information, which I believe is a way to do this spaced repetition. Maybe not the best way. Yep, fine, no problem. But as a way, that's my version of what we have been doing on the floor. And oftentimes that 5-minute quick, 2 or 5 times, depending, is enough that they get to touch that information, right? And really, hopefully, fingers crossed, your students are maybe at least thinking about this information outside of class. Wow, maybe they're actually practicing this information outside of class. Would be even better. But okay, let's be realistic. Sometimes they don't. Most of the time they don't. Almost every time they don't. Got it. No problem. So giving them that 5-minute time period to work on that information is a great opportunity for the students to practice that information, probably for the first time since they did it in the class the last time. So that kind of fits the bill of two, right? So number one is it's kind of working into that spaced repetition. But number two, it also is facilitating the home practice time that I'm almost certain that many, if not all of the students are not actually doing at home. And if they are, they're all the better for it. It's not like I'm shunning them great, awesome, good. You'll be even better when you show up to class and you spend 5 more minutes on it. Wonderful, good job. And so that's my kind of my twofold fix to that. Number one is it sort of gets into that spaced repetition, but on top of that, it gives them an opportunity to practice that information in class. And that 5-minute window, mind you, is total self-practice time. Because we have a class and it has 4 belt groups in it. We say, okay, listen, you got 5 minutes, practice your form 2 or 3 times, and then we're going to come together, we're going to end class. And normally that's the very last thing we do for the day. But again, just to have that extra touch on that. And again, that's all active recall, self-practice time, and I found that to be very beneficial. Now, in talking about this spaced repetition and learning some information about this, going through and hearing about this study that they did, one takeaway that I may be apt to try, maybe on one, so we have classes on Monday and Wednesday and Tuesday and Thursday, so maybe I take out the Monday, Wednesday class and I test this on them. And then I can, maybe report back with feedback if you guys so wish. But what I would perhaps like to do is do new information, spend 10 or 15 minutes on whatever that new stuff is on, let's say, Monday. Then don't review it on Wednesday. Then when they come back on Monday the following week, don't review it, and then review it on that following Wednesday. It'll be a little bit greater than 8 days. It'll be 9 days, in fact. But it would be an interesting kind of insight to see if or how or perhaps why we might want to incorporate more of this spaced repetition. And then that would be an interesting insight to how far out should that first repetition of the information, to be. How far out should it be? And so that I would very much like to try that and just to see what takeaways that could bring, to instead of reviewing it in the very next class 2 days later, even 1 week later, but to wait a full, 2 classes later, which in most cases would be 9 days, just to kind of see, if I can come up with the same results as they had in their, of course, because martial arts is going to be different than whatever they used to base that study on. That was all, facts and figures and math or whatever the class was, whatever the lecture was about. But this moving our body through the information, I just wonder, if the takeaway is the same, and then if so, how much more beneficial is that, and then where else can we kind of implement that, or at least try it to see if we can implement it further on a more normal basis.
Do you think we should preface or pre-frame them for that type of quiz, so to speak? Reference it. We don't say, hey, we're not going to cover this for 2 weeks.
No.
Or 2 classes.
Nope.
You don't think so?
No, because I think that would skew the results.
Well, I'm thinking that's how their test went for the York University Toronto quiz. Is here's this quiz of information. You're going to have a final exam now. Maybe they didn't tell about final exam, which
Well, they probably knew about the
did.
final exam, but I don't know if they knew about the quiz frequency. And really, the quiz frequency is what I'm equating to the frequency of drills in the class.
Their final exam would be like their belt test or something.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, and that would be hard to. It would be really difficult to judge that on I'd have to give Group A red stripes or something on their belt, and Group B got blue stripes on their belt to really. If this was going to be like a full-on study, but I'm just kind of curious, and so I'm just going to try this hypothesis, that they did in a school setting, in our school setting, in a martial arts school setting, as a movement based, and so just as a guess to see what happens, and I guess thinking about this, we sort of do this within the black belt class with their self-defense, whereas we learn new information on A day, we learn different new information on B day, and then kind of on the following A day or even B day is where we kind of review that information. But that's, really exactly this. That's the spaced repetition. And they go through that process where they learn a little bit, then they review a little bit, they learn a little bit, and then they do almost exactly this. Through their self-defense. We don't do it so much with their forms, but their self-defense is more or less exactly set up like this.
Well, their forms, if they're learning a new form, it's usually spaced. They usually learn a new part on an A day, and they don't come back to it until the following A day.
Right,
Unless we happen to practice it in class.
But there's normally at least a little bit of practice time on that B day.
Sure.
So with this, with
More
their
intentionally spaced out.
Yes, and their self-defense is intentionally spaced out.
Sometimes we'll review, but maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we'll find out.
Yeah, we'll do a test. We'll see. I'm curious to see, if we can actually bring this into the martial arts realm, sort of say, and how or if this is even beneficial at all.
Yes, sir.
And now would be a good time to do it at the beginning.
Yes, sir. Yeah. We've had 1 class so far. 2.
2. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
2 classes so far. Yep.
Yeah.
Awesome. Any additional or last minute thoughts on spaced repetition?
Yeah, I believe that the key for spaced repetition is the ability to actively recall and consistently bring that information to the front of your brain. Like we talked about, the more times you can gradually go through that information, or gradually give them the information, and then go through and review that in a gradual type pattern, not all at once and then nothing, and then all at once and then nothing, where you're kind of cramming. But that process of frequently, or perhaps how frequently you bring that information back up to the front of your brain, really is one of the keys. And then the second key, I believe, is the active recall, where you are actively thinking about that, almost in the case where you're making, in fact, you are making mistakes, but you want to be able to make those mistakes in a controlled type atmosphere where you can actually learn and grow from those mistakes. But it's because the information is just out of reach, just on the other side of your fingers as you try to reach in and kind of grab that information. And so really, I think twofold, that is the key. Is obviously the number of times you review that information. Repetition is, of course, the king for this. But then on top of that, actively recalling that information. And again, almost where it's just outside of your grasp, or almost outside your grasp, where you're making those mistakes, but in an atmosphere that you are functionally able to learn and grow from those mistakes.
Yes, sir. Looking forward to diving in and checking out that spaced repetition. As always, you can find us online at any of the socials: Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, Reddit. You can find us at MA Teaching Tactics, MA for Martial Arts Teaching Tactics. Again, that is MA Teaching Tactics. Reach out to us. Tell us what you think about the idea of spaced repetition. Also, remember, in a few episodes here, we'll be doing our Q&A session. So leave us a question on Facebook, tweet at us, leave a comment on YouTube, message or post on our Reddit thread, message me on Instagram, any of that stuff. Reach out, ask us your questions. That way we have some feedback from you guys, and we can talk through what you might be wondering in our Q&A episode. But until next time, I'm Chris Kent.
And I'm Chris Bean.